This is one of those deep dives that really got me thinking when I first learned about it, and I have a feeling you'll see why. We're talking about Taiwan, a place that, on the surface, it might not seem like a global superpower, but trust me, it is, in fact. Some experts even say this small island could be the flashpoint for a world war.
Yeah, it might sound like hyperbole, but it's really not. And the reason all comes down to one word: semiconductors.
Okay, so we're talking about those tiny chips that power everything around us. You probably have a phone within arm's reach right now. I'm willing to bet it has chips made in Taiwan inside it. But here's the thing that's always fascinated me. How did Taiwan become the go-to source for this incredibly complex technology? They weren't always a tech titan, were they?
Not at all. If you rewind just a few decades to the 1950s, Taiwan was a completely different story. We're talking about a nation recovering from war, heavily dependent on foreign aid, with an economy that was still really rooted in agriculture.
So how did they go from picking crops to producing chips that are, in many ways, more precious than gold? What's the secret sauce?
Well, there wasn't one single aha moment. It was a strategic, kind of a multi-decade transformation. And it really began in the 1960s with this push towards industrialization.
Right, but initially it wasn't the high-tech boom we associate with Taiwan today, was it?
You're exactly right. They started with those more traditional manufacturing industries,
Right.
like textiles, toys, things that didn't necessarily require, highly specialized knowledge or infrastructure.
Kind of like a testing the waters.
Yeah.
Getting their footing before diving into the deep end of the tech world.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, and as they gained experience and confidence, I think, crucially as well, their ambitions grew. By the 1970s, the Taiwanese government, they recognized the massive potential of semiconductors. They saw that this wasn't just a passing trend. This was the future, and they were determined to be a part of it.
Yeah, I can just picture it now. Some government officials huddled in a room, pointing at a circuit board and saying, let's build these tiny brain things.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing it wasn't quite that simple, was it? Were there massive hurdles to overcome?
You're not wrong. Building a semiconductor sector from scratch, it's one of the most complex and capital-intensive endeavors that a nation can undertake. You've got astronomical upfront costs, the need for an insanely skilled workforce, and this ever-present threat of the technology becoming obsolete practically overnight. It's a risk that most nations wouldn't even consider.
So how did Taiwan overcome those challenges? I mean, they couldn't just conjure up chip-making wizards out of thin air, could they?
Yep.
Okay, maybe they could if they were playing a game of civilization. But
Yeah.
this was real life.
It's true. You can't just conjure wizards, no matter how much we might wish for it. Taiwan took a different approach, a brilliantly pragmatic one, and it can really be summed up in 3 words: copy, invest, and educate.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. I'm intrigued. Let's break those down. Starting with copy. That sounds a little, shall we say, legally ambiguous? Were they reverse engineering chips in some secret underground lab?
It wasn't exactly a secret underground lair scenario, but you're picking up on a key part of their strategy. They legally licensed patents from established companies like Philips and Sony, and this gave them a foundation to build on without needing to reinvent the wheel.
So they were essentially speed-running their way up the tech tree. I like it. But even with blueprints, you need the resources to make those chips. That's where invest comes in, right? What did that look like?
You nailed it. Taiwan doubled down, making massive investments in building these cutting-edge fabrication facilities, often referred to as fabs. These fabs are like the semiconductor world's version of Fort Knox. Incredibly expensive, meticulously controlled environments. They're also essential for producing the most advanced chips.
That's a ton of capital. Was the Taiwanese government just printing money at this point?
Well, they certainly weren't afraid to spend it, but it was more nuanced than just throwing money around. They implemented these smart tax policies, streamlined regulations, and they created these special economic zones, which are specific geographic areas with different economic regulations to attract foreign companies and foster this environment of innovation.
It's like they were building the perfect incubator for a tech explosion. But you've got the blueprints, you've got the fabs, you still need the right people to design, operate, and constantly innovate in this high-pressure field. And that's where educate enters the picture, right?
You're catching on quickly. The Taiwanese government understood that none of this would be possible without a highly skilled workforce, so they poured resources into education, particularly in STEM fields, creating this pipeline of engineers and scientists.
It's like they were playing a strategic game on easy mode, investing heavily in education to unlock those higher-tier technologies, years ahead of everyone else. But was it just education? Or were there other factors at play?
It wasn't just about pumping out graduates with fancy degrees. It was about connecting that education directly to the industry. So they established these strong partnerships between universities and businesses, making sure that graduates had the precise skills that companies were desperate for. This created this dynamic where students weren't just learning theory, they were gaining practical experience. By working on real-world problems,
So by the mid-1980s, Taiwan had completed this pretty remarkable transformation. From an agricultural economy to a budding tech player, they had the blueprints,
Yeah.
the resources,
Yeah.
and the minds. But how did they go from simply making chips to becoming the undisputed heavyweights of semiconductor manufacturing? That's what
Yeah.
I'm really curious about.
Yeah, this is where things get incredibly interesting, even for those already familiar with the industry. So you have to remember those early days when companies would design and manufacture their own chips. We call those companies integrated device manufacturers, or IDMs.
Hold on. Could you back up a bit? You mentioned IDM companies, but I'm not entirely sure I understand what that means.
Of course. An IDM is a company that handles the entire process of creating a chip, from the design phase all the way through manufacturing. Think of it like a company that grows its own cotton, weaves its own fabric, and then sews that fabric into clothing, all under one roof.
That makes sense. So IDMs were the norm in the early days of the semiconductor industry.
Precisely. But these IDMs were about to face some stiff competition, all thanks to a revolutionary new approach that originated in Taiwan.
All right, you've got my attention. What was this game-changing approach, and who was the mastermind behind it?
Get ready to meet Morris Chang, a Taiwanese engineer who returned home after this long and successful career in the U.S. semiconductor industry. He saw a different path, a way for Taiwan to truly stand out in the global market. In 1987, he founded a company called TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And the semiconductor world has never been the same since.
TSMC. Yeah, that name definitely rings a bell. They're like the rock stars of the semiconductor world now, right? But what did they do differently? What was Morris Chang's big idea?
What's remarkable about TSMC is that they decided to focus on one thing and one thing only, manufacturing semiconductors. They weren't interested in designing their own chips or selling finished products. They were like the ultimate chip-making mercenaries, building to spec whatever their clients could dream up.
Wait, so their entire business model was based on other companies trusting them with their designs. That seems incredibly risky. What if TSMC just,
Stole those designs and ran off with them. What prevented them from undercutting their own clients in the market?
That was a major concern at the time, and understandably so. But Chang had a vision, and a key part of that vision was building trust. He understood that by focusing solely on manufacturing, TSMC could offer something unique and incredibly valuable: unparalleled efficiency, lower costs, and perhaps most importantly, absolute discretion.
So they were like the Switzerland of chip manufacturing, neutral ground where
Right.
anyone, even competitors, could go to get the best possible product without fear of their intellectual property being stolen. You got it. It was a gamble, a calculated risk, but one that paid off spectacularly. By specializing, TSMC was able to optimize its processes to a degree that no IDM could match. They became incredibly efficient, driving down costs, building the stellar reputation for reliability and confidentiality.
This is where that business school term core competency comes to mind. They found what they were amazing at and went all in on it.
Exactly. And this laser-like focus didn't just benefit TSMC, it had this ripple effect throughout Taiwan's entire semiconductor ecosystem. It's what we call the mushroom model of growth.
Mushroom model. I'm picturing a mushroom cloud of economic prosperity. All right, you have to explain this one because now I'm really curious.
Not quite a cloud. But imagine a single successful company like TSMC as the initial mushroom. As it grows and thrives, it creates the ideal conditions for a whole network of specialized companies to sprout up around it, each one supporting and feeding off the success of the other.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture. This isn't just about one company's success. It's about an entire interconnected web of businesses all working in concert.
You're exactly right, and that's precisely what happened in Taiwan. TSMC's success didn't happen in isolation. It spawned this whole network of supporting businesses, each with its own unique expertise. Testing, packaging, design, you name it. They all flourished in this collaborative ecosystem.
So instead of one company trying to be a jack of all trades, they created this incredibly specialized and efficient system, almost like a colony of ants, each one playing a specific role to achieve a common goal, in this case, complete semiconductor domination.
That's a fantastic analogy, this interconnectedness, this specialization. It became Taiwan's secret sauce. It allowed them to outperform much larger, more established players on the world stage. But their success attracted attention, and not all of it was welcome.
Because Taiwan's incredible rise to the top of the tech world It coincided with this shifting geopolitical landscape. It's one thing to be a semiconductor powerhouse, but it's another thing entirely when your success puts you at the center of a global tug-of-war between superpowers. We're talking about China's ambitions, U.S. anxieties, and the very real potential for conflict, right? This tiny island that most people couldn't even point to on a map now holds an incredible amount of influence over the future.
That's precisely where this deep dive takes an interesting turn. Understanding what happens next requires us to look beyond the chips themselves and delve into the complex world of geopolitics.
We'll do just that after a quick break. And we're back, diving headfirst into the geopolitical deep end. Right before the break, we were talking about how Taiwan went from, this nation focused on agriculture to a tech titan in just a few decades. But as you pointed out, the success has placed them, well, square in the middle of a global power struggle.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how something seemingly so small, in this case a tiny island, can become so incredibly important almost overnight. I mean, Taiwan essentially controls this critical choke point in the global tech supply chain. It's like holding the master key to the future, and you can bet that everyone, especially China, is watching very closely.
It's like those old maps where they'd mark uncharted areas with, here be dragons, except now it's, here be semiconductors, and it's got everyone feeling a little uneasy, especially when you consider, China's ambitions to, let's be blunt, absorb Taiwan, both economically and politically. I mean, they haven't exactly been quiet about it. And getting their hands on Taiwan's semiconductor industry, that would be a huge win for them, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. For China, it's about more than just getting their hands on the latest gadgets. It's about projecting power, asserting their dominance in the region, and diminishing U.S. influence on the world stage.
So we're talking economics, national pride, security. It's a whole mixed bag of motivations. And speaking of the U.S., they can't be thrilled about this situation, can they? I mean, they're not just going to sit back and watch one of their biggest rivals potentially corner the market on a technology that's vital to, well, pretty much everything these days.
You're right. The U.S. is deeply concerned, and for good reason. Not only does Taiwan hold this key position in the global tech supply chain, but they're also a vital democratic ally in a region that's becoming increasingly strategically important.
So let's talk about the elephant in the room. This isn't just about smartphones and laptops anymore, is it? This has serious implications for military power as well.
Exactly. Modern militaries rely on advanced semiconductors for everything, from fighter jets and drones to missile guidance systems and communication networks. And the unfortunate reality is that many of those critical chips come from, you guessed it, Taiwan.
Which puts the U.S. in kind of a tricky position, wouldn't you say? I mean, they have to find a way to support Taiwan without provoking China. What does that even look like in practice? Are they just writing checks and hoping for the best?
It's a delicate balancing act for sure. The U.S. has been providing Taiwan with some military aid to bolster their defenses, but they're also taking a more long-term approach by investing heavily in their own domestic chip production capabilities.
So it's like they're trying to play catch-up in a race they didn't even know they were running, while simultaneously trying to keep the peace. That can't be easy.
It's a high-stakes game of chess, where one wrong move could have these disastrous consequences. But here's where it gets even more complicated for the U.S. Simply throwing money at the problem isn't enough. Remember how Taiwan built its semiconductor dominance? It wasn't just about cash, it was about expertise, collaboration, this highly skilled workforce, all things that take years, even decades to develop.
Right, they created this incredibly specialized ecosystem in Taiwan. You can't just snap your fingers and recreate that overnight. It makes you wonder, are these efforts to boost domestic chip production in the U.S. and other countries, are they too little too late?
That's the billion-dollar question. The situation is incredibly fluid, and there's no guarantee that anyone, even a superpower like the U.S., can easily replicate what Taiwan has accomplished.
It's a lot to wrap your head around. I don't know about you, but when I really started digging into all of this, I kept coming back to this one thought, like what would happen if the music stopped? What if something happened and those chips were suddenly unavailable? What would that mean for our everyday lives?
It's a question worth pondering, because the reality is that our dependence on Taiwan for these tiny ships, it's only growing. I mean, think about the rise of artificial intelligence, the increasing automation of, well, just about everything. All of that requires more chips, more advanced chips.
It's both fascinating and a little terrifying how much our world relies on this one small island. And on that note, I think it's time for another quick break. When we come back, we'll delve into those what-if scenarios. What does the future hold for Taiwan? For the global tech industry? And for all of us who rely on these little chips every single day? Stay tuned.
And we're back. For the final part of our deep dive into the world of semiconductors, we've talked about Taiwan's incredible journey to the top of the tech world and the high-stakes geopolitical game that's unfolding because of it. So let's talk about the future. What are the potential scenarios that could play out, and what does it all mean for
Well,
everyone?
well, you're asking the right questions
Mm-hmm.
because the future of this industry, and frankly, its global impact is anything but certain. But there are a few, I think, key questions and potential scenarios that are worth exploring. Let's hear them. Honestly, learning all of this has been eye-opening, but it's also a bit unnerving. Can Taiwan hold on to its crown? Can anyone catch up to them in this semiconductor race?
Well, the pressure is definitely on. China is pouring immense resources into building up its own domestic chip industry. They've made it clear that they want to be a global leader in technology, and that means closing the gap with Taiwan.
So we're talking about this high-stakes game of technological leapfrog. And it's not just China, right? I understand that the U.S. and other countries are also trying to ramp up their domestic chip production as well.
Exactly. It's this trend that's been called reshoring, or sometimes friendshoring, the idea of bringing semiconductor manufacturing back to their own shores, or at least closer to allied nations. It's all about reducing their reliance on Taiwan and creating this more diversified global supply chain.
On the surface, that seems like a good thing. Spreading the risk, making sure all our eggs aren't in one basket. That makes sense, doesn't it?
In theory, it's a smart move, but as we've discussed, building and maintaining a globally competitive semiconductor industry isn't something you do overnight. It takes time, money, expertise, and frankly, a little bit of luck. There's no guarantee that these efforts will be enough to fully break Taiwan's dominance.
Because they've spent decades building those relationships, developing that talent pool, creating that incredibly specialized ecosystem. You can't just, copy-paste that to another part of the world and expect the same results, can you?
You can't. And that brings up another critical question. Can Taiwan itself maintain its technological edge? I mean, this is an industry that's all about innovation. It's about constantly pushing the boundaries of what's possible. To stay on top, they can't afford to rest on their laurels.
Right, it's like they're the Tiger Woods of tech. Everyone studied their game, and now everyone is gunning for them.
Yeah, exactly. Taiwan has to keep innovating. They have to keep investing, keep developing the next generation of chip-making technology, all while navigating this increasingly complex geopolitical landscape.
And that's what makes this whole situation so fascinating. On one hand, Taiwan has benefited tremendously from being the world's go-to source for these crucial chips. But on the other hand, that success has made them a target, a prize to be fought over.
It's a delicate balancing act. And it's not just about economics. It's about their very identity as a nation. Taiwan has in many ways become the Switzerland of high tech, trying to navigate these tensions by being indispensable to everyone. Can they maintain that neutrality as the pressure mounts?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's a question that has enormous implications, not just for Taiwan, but for the entire world. I mean, we're not just talking about who gets the coolest gadgets or who wins the race to build the fastest computer. We're talking about economic security, national defense, and the potential for conflict between superpowers. And the really wild part is, all of this hinges on these tiny little chips that most people don't even think about.
It's a potent reminder, I think, of how interconnected our world has become. And it underscores the importance of understanding. Not just how technology works, but also the geopolitical and economic forces that shape its development and distribution.
You've given our listeners a lot to consider today, and I have to say it's definitely changed how I view something as simple as picking up my phone. So before we wrap up, is there anything else you think our listeners should be paying attention to as this story unfolds? Any parting thoughts for us?
Yeah, I would just encourage your listeners to look beyond the headlines. Pay attention to the investments that are being made, the partnerships that are being formed, the technological breakthroughs that are happening in this industry. And ask yourself this: what would happen if, for whatever reason, those chips were no longer available? How would that impact your life, your work, your future?
That's a question we all need to be thinking about. It's been a fascinating and frankly a little unnerving deep dive, but I think that's the point, isn't it? To really understand the world, we have to be willing to look beyond the surface and grapple with the complex realities that shape our lives. So until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep diving deep.